Welcome to part 3 of the video series Embedding Evaluations in Everyday Activities, a tutorial designed to introduce the concept of opportunistic experiments. In part 3, we'll talk about how to address some common challenges and concerns about opportunistic experiments. As described in the first two videos, opportunistic experiments are a type of randomized controlled trial, or RCT, that takes advantage of a planned intervention or policy change. We also refer to these RCTs as experiments. In this video, we'll first introduce 4 common concerns that often come up before starting an opportunistic experiment and 3 key challenges that often appear once an experiment is underway. After introducing a concern or challenge, we'll outline some suggestions for ways of addressing it. One of the most common concerns from teachers, parents, and school leaders regarding RCTs or experiments is about fairness. Is it fair to deny some schools, teachers, or students access to a new program or resource? Some educators and parents may believe that only providing services or a new program or resource to some participants is unfair to those who do not receive the program. In other words, you might be concerned that the control group in the opportunistic experiment is missing out on a valuable program. One response to a concern about access is to remind participants that without a study, we don't know if the program is even beneficial. If we don't know whether an intervention works, we don't know whether we're denying schools, teachers, or students access to something that will actually help them. In some cases, a promising program is not as helpful as it might appear, especially for particular students in particular schools. The program could actually make student outcomes worse instead of better, or just leave them the same. The best way to find out whether the program is worth its cost or will help at all is to conduct an experiment so we can be sure that the program had an effect. Let's look at an example of how concerns about fairness could play out. In this diagram, there are 2 similar schools in a district, but only one can receive a program or resource. This program is shown by the green star next to the school. The designers of the program hope that it will improve student outcomes. Educators and parents may be concerned that this is unfair to the school that will not receive the program. It's important to keep in mind that even without a study, there will be situations where only some schools or students can receive a given resource or program. When schools and districts have limited resources, they must make decisions about which programs to fund and which schools or students can receive a resource. Opportunistic experiments can be a way to learn from these situations where limited resources will lead to differences in any case. Indeed, random assignment might be the fairest way to decide who receives the intervention because everyone has the same chance to receive it. The second concern is related to the first. Districts often wonder whether schools assigned to the control group can ever receive the intervention. The good news is there's definitely a way to accommodate that in the design of the experiment. First of all, assignment to the control group does not have to be permanent. It only has to last as long as you'll be collecting data for the study. And districts can assure schools in the control group that they are next in line to receive the intervention once resources are available. Often districts use a staggered rollout of new programs in any case because of resource constraints or limited capacity to roll out to everyone all at once. In these situations, you can use random assignment to assign the order of the rollout and maximize your chances to learn from it. Going back to the 2 schools in our first example, we can see how a staggered rollout might work for them. In the first year, only one school receives the resource and the other does not. At the end of that year, data is collected and the effects of the resource can be measured. In the second year, both schools receive the resource. This might be appealing to educators and parents concerned about whether opportunistic experiments can be fair to everyone involved. A third common concern is the expense of conducting a randomized controlled trial. Districts may be reluctant to take on an opportunistic experiment if they believe that the benefits will not justify the expense. But under the right circumstances, an experiment can be less expensive than you might expect. Experiments are not necessarily as expensive as districts may fear. Identifying participants and collecting data can be large expenses in an evaluation, but opportunistic experiments take advantage of some features that can reduce these costs. Districts may be testing something they are already planning to implement, If this is true, they will already have to figure out which participants will get the program, so identifying participants does not represent an added expense. When the study relies on data already collected by the district, there's little or no added cost for data collection because of the study. And while experiments have costs, they could also save the district money. For example, learning that a program is ineffective and discontinuing it can lead to big savings down the road, not to mention better outcomes for students. A fourth common concern is that the opportunistic experiment will be disruptive and distracting to students and educators. You may be concerned that the data collection and other procedures associated with the study could distract teachers and students from day-to-day learning and instruction. Opportunistic experiments typically avoid some of the disruption associated with other types of evaluations. Because an opportunistic experiment is testing something the district already wants to do, it's not adding any new disruption. The implementation of the new program would have happened anyway. And because the study focuses on data you already have, you don't need to add any additional testing or data collection. Now that we've discussed some common concerns that frequently come up before starting an opportunistic experiment, let's talk about other kinds of challenges that might not arise until an experiment is underway and how to address these challenges. One challenge encountered during random assignment studies is when a participant, a school, classroom, or student, must receive a program or resource, or is otherwise unable to be randomized. For example, a given service could be required by a student's IEP or an educator's professional development plan. Another example is when a school wants to ensure that a set of twins will be in the same class. Cases like this can be addressed by recognizing that participants who are obligated to receive the service or program can be excluded from random assignment and the study findings. So students, teachers, or schools that are required to receive services can still be served, but they will be not included as part of the study. It's important to identify these cases before random assignment and to make sure that all exemptions are accurately documented. This way you are comparing apples to apples and only examining the outcomes of students, schools, or classrooms that were actually randomly assigned. There are still drawbacks to this approach since it limits both sample size and the ability to draw generalizations about the potential effects on other settings in schools. For example, if a specific group of students is excluded from the study, you will not be able to make any conclusions about how the program would affect that group. Even after addressing some of the common concerns, building support for random assignment can be a challenge. This might be especially true if a district or large agency has signed on to the study, but individual principals, teachers, or parent groups are not on board. They might express opposition as, "We're educators, not researchers. We already know that what we are doing works. Research draws focus away from getting things done. We're already overstretched as it is." After listening to individuals' concerns and incorporating them into the design and implementation of the study, how can you communicate the value of conducting experiments? It is key to communicate that experiments can help us understand which programs and resources work to improve educator effectiveness and student outcomes. It is also helpful to explain that random assignment is the best way to identify effective programs and focus limited resources on what works. A final challenge is balancing the desire to look at long-term outcomes with the pressure on educators to make quick decisions. From high school graduation to college enrollment and persistence to earnings and employment as an adult, many of the outcomes that educators care about most cannot be observed for several years. In the meantime, districts and schools need to make policy decisions quickly. An educator might ask, what if the outcomes we care about most can't be observed for years, but we need to make decisions now? How can you set yourself up for learning the most you can from an opportunistic experiment? There are a variety of approaches that might help you make the most of the experiment. When possible, districts and educators can identify short-term outcomes that may shed light on long-term outcomes. One example is that timely credit completion in 9th or 10th grade gives you information about the likelihood of future high school graduation. Another option is for districts and educators to track student IDs that would allow for long-term follow-up through a database like the National Student Clearinghouse, which tracks postsecondary outcomes. In this case, it is important to maintain records on which sample members were in the treatment or control group for later analysis. The district can request outcomes from the clearinghouse and conduct a follow-up analysis several years later allowing them to assess a program's effects on these longer-term outcomes. We hope these examples have helped you to identify ways you could overcome challenges to participating in opportunistic experiments in your context. 3 key points to remember are: educators often have reasonable concerns about the challenges of participating in a study. Acknowledge questions about fairness, access, expense, and disruption, and take time to reassure stakeholders and address their concerns. Accommodating exemptions from random assignment, building support for the study, and balancing short-term and long-term outcomes all require planning, forethought, and adaptability. Challenges can arise both before and during the study, but these challenges should not dissuade districts and schools from embarking on an opportunistic experiment and from using research to learn how to help students more effectively. Be sure to take a look at the first 2 videos in this series, which discuss what opportunistic experiments are and how to recognize opportunities to learn what works.